In every single presidential election in the United States, there is always one true winner, regardless of who the candidate is. That is Wall Street, the U.S. financial services industry, including large banks and investment funds and asset managers, most of which are located in New York. In every single presidential election in the U.S., Wall Street is always one of the largest funders of the political campaigns of both candidates from the Republican and Democratic parties. And the 2024 election is no exception. Donald Trump portrays himself as a so-called anti-establishment candidate, and his supporters claim that he is going to change the status quo. But in reality, just like Joe Biden, Donald Trump is being funded by Wall Street. And this May, it was revealed that the CEO of the world's largest landlord is funding Donald Trump's campaign. I am talking about Blackstone, which is one of the world's largest asset managers, and it is the largest commercial landlord in human history. On its website, Blackstone proudly describes itself as, quote, the world's largest alternative asset manager with more than $1 trillion in assets under management. And in its portfolio, it owns 12,500 real estate assets, which is actually a conservative estimate. Blackstone owns and manages over 300,000 units of rental housing in the US, making it the largest landlord in the country. The British newspaper The Guardian noted that Blackstone is the largest commercial landlord in history. In the past 2 decades, the Wall Street firm has quietly taken control of entire apartment blocks, care homes, student housing, railway arches, film studios, offices, hotels, logistics warehouses, and data centers. And as The Guardian wrote, Blackstone doesn't just own real estate. It owns everything, including Donald Trump, by the way. Because when these Wall Street firms fund politicians, they are investing in the politician like they invest in real estate or stocks or bonds. They know that if they fund the campaign of a politician, that politician will give them favors when they enter office. This is essentially legalized bribery, but in the US, it's entirely commonplace among candidates from both major political parties. And I want to be very clear here today because I'm not trying to defend Joe Biden by pointing out that Donald Trump is funded by Wall Street. They're both funded and owned by Wall Street. In fact, the irony is that while Donald Trump's campaign is being funded by the CEO of Blackstone, many of the top economic and financial officials in the Biden administration are from BlackRock. So here we can see that these two competing Wall Street firms are each closely allied with the major political parties. Blackstone and its billionaire founder and CEO, Stephen Schwarzman, are some of the top contributors to the Republican Party, funding Donald Trump and his allies, whereas BlackRock is more closely affiliated with the Democrats and Joe Biden. Now, for people who might be confused, what is the difference between Blackstone and BlackRock? Their names are similar, but they're not the same firm. However, they both are investment management companies based in New York City. Now, BlackRock is a more traditional asset manager. What it does is it manages the assets of the rich around the world and of institutional investors, like, for instance, pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. So essentially, if you are very, very wealthy, what do you do with all of your money? Well, you invest that in assets to increase your wealth. But who does that? Many of these oligarchs, these rich capitalists, are so wealthy that they invest their wealth in investment funds, and they're overseen by asset management firms, and they hire entire teams of people to invest the money of the rich in assets that bring yields so they can get wealthier and wealthier. BlackRock is the world's largest investment company, but its investments tend to be more traditional. Things like stocks, which is partial ownership in a company, or bonds, which is a form of debt like government bonds or corporate bonds, which are IOUs from those institutions. So BlackRock tends to invest the wealth of the rich around the world and different institutional investors in those assets to make them wealthier. Blackstone is very similar. However, Blackstone is the world's largest alternative investment company, which means that it tends to invest the money of the rich in assets that are not stocks and bonds, things like real estate and veterinary offices and doctors' offices and retirement homes and hospitals. So Blackstone has become the world's largest landlord, and Blackstone also runs one of the world's largest private equity funds, which is where they buy entire companies, they take them over, they take on huge sums of debt for what are called leveraged buyouts. They take over companies and then they strip those companies for assets. They cut workers' wages, they lay off workers, they cut healthcare and other benefits, they reduce the quality of the care, and then they later sell those companies for parts, they make a profit, or they actually end up making those companies go bankrupt, which is what happened with major companies like Toys R Us, for instance, which was made bankrupt by private equity. I'll talk more about that later, but this is not a productive industry. This is, by definition, a parasitic industry. They don't produce anything of value. They don't produce goods that people need for their lives to be more comfortable. Instead, they suck value out of existing institutions. These asset managers on Wall Street, which emerged out of investment banks like Goldman Sachs, their job is to make the rich richer. They don't actually contribute to producing things in the real economy. And in Wall Street in general, the billionaire oligarchs who fund US politicians, they don't contribute to the real economy. They are parasites on the real economy. If you want to be very rich, not a million, if you want to be a billionaire, you don't simply invest in industrial manufacturing. You can maybe be a millionaire. If you actually want to be an oligarch, you get involved in finance, like these firms. And it should not surprise you to learn that the Blackstone CEO and founder, the billionaire oligarch Stephen Schwarzman, who is funding Donald Trump's campaign, he is the highest paid corporate executive on Wall Street, the highest paid CEO in the entire US financial services industry. Just in 1 year, in 2022, Stephen Schwarzman made $1.27 billion in compensation and in dividends. And in 2021, he made $1.1 billion in 1 year. This is in addition to all of the investments that he has made, to his other sources of wealth. This is just from the work he did at Blackstone. And again, this is the oligarch who is helping to oversee Donald Trump's presidential campaign. The Financial Times reported on this May. It noted that Donald Trump has been going around on Wall Street trying to get more and more Wall Street money to fund his campaign. Donald Trump has been tapping finance, technology, and energy billionaires for cash infusions. Trump swept through Texas to raise money from oil tycoons. And Donald Trump held a fundraiser with a hedge fund billionaire, John Paulson, who hosted a fundraiser for Trump in Florida and raised more than $50 million. Stephen Schwarzman, the Blackstone CEO, is a top ally of Donald Trump. He also helped to fund Donald Trump's previous campaigns, including he gave Trump millions of dollars for his re-election campaign in 2020. And in 2017, Donald Trump rewarded his Wall Street funder by inviting Schwarzman to chair an advisory board for Donald Trump. And then they traveled together to Saudi Arabia. And in Riyadh, the Saudi monarchy pledged to match up to $20 billion in contributions from other investors into a Blackstone infrastructure fund. So this is why these capitalist oligarchs like this Blackstone CEO, Schwarzman, this is why they fund US politicians, because it's legal corruption. They know that when the politician they are buying, they are investing in, when they win the election, that politician will help them make more and more money. So, okay, billionaire oligarchs, they pay millions of dollars funding the campaigns of politicians like Trump or Biden. And then when Trump or Biden enter the White House, they make billions of dollars in profits. The Financial Times also reported this May that Donald Trump has been getting millions of dollars from the oil and gas industry. As the FT wrote, Donald Trump swept through Texas seeking to bolster his campaign war chest with donations from oil barons and moguls controlling vast fortunes spanning sectors from sports to automotives. Trump has sought to shore up support among deep-pocketed executives in the U.S. fossil fuel industry with a pledge to rip up much of President Joe Biden's environmental and climate agenda and allow the industry to drill, baby, drill. Now, this Republican narrative that Biden and the Democrats oppose the oil and gas industry is hilariously ironic because the actual facts show the complete opposite. The Financial Times reported in February that oil and gas industry profits have nearly tripled under President Biden. There is a laughable chart in here that shows how the profits of the fossil fuel industry have absolutely skyrocketed under Joe Biden. And the FT wrote, this flies in the face of Republican arguments that the Biden administration has suffocated the industry. The article noted that U.S. production of oil and natural gas has reached new records under President Joe Biden. And in the first 3 years of the Trump administration, the net income of the fossil fuel industry was $112 billion. In the first 3 years of Biden, it was $313 billion in net income. At the same time, the collective market capitalization of the top oil and gas companies increased by 132% in the first 3 years of the Biden administration, whereas they increased just 12% in Trump's first 3 years. U.S. production has smashed records, and under Biden, in 2023, the U.S. became the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, LNG. So this shows the hypocrisy of the Democrats and Biden, who claim to care about climate change. In reality, they are handing enormous profits to the fossil fuel industry, while the Republicans hilariously claim that Biden and the Democrats oppose fossil fuel. So here I really need to stress again, stop paying attention to this ridiculous propaganda in the Western corporate media talking about the Republicans and Democrats, Trump and Biden. Whoever wins the election, it is always Wall Street, the 1%, the capitalist oligarchy. They're the ones who always win every single presidential election in the US. They fund every candidate, and every candidate serves their economic interests. Yahoo Finance published an article this May that really summarizes perfectly how absurd it is to call Trump an anti-establishment populist. The article is titled, "Prominent Billionaires from Wall Street to Silicon Valley Are Warming Up to Donald Trump." Billionaires from coast to coast are putting their influence and money behind Donald Trump. Some have already donated millions to his campaign. Some have announced plans to do so. Trump, meanwhile, is returning the favor. He is reportedly promising to make policy changes that would help their businesses and perhaps even rely on them as advisors if he returns to the White House. And Tesla CEO Elon Musk has discussed a formal advisory role for the billionaire if Trump wins his second term in the White House. So meet the new boss, same as the old boss. And of course, this is no surprise because Donald Trump is himself a billionaire capitalist oligarch. And back in his first term, Trump cut taxes for the rich, which, by the way, massively increased US government debt, but he did it on behalf of his rich friends and funders. And in April, Trump held a big fundraiser in which he raised millions of dollars from his rich friends. And he told them that if he wins his second term, he's going to extend those tax cuts for the rich. So this is how real politics gets made in the US. It's quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. You give me millions of dollars, I'll cut billions of dollars worth of taxes for you. It doesn't matter that Donald Trump and his allies claim to be anti-establishment, or the media calls him a populist. The word populist doesn't mean anything because he is funded by the same capitalist oligarchs who are also funding the other Republicans and the Democrats. Joe Biden himself made this very clear back in 2019 when he was starting his presidential campaign, and he spoke to a room full of rich donors in New York in a fancy hotel, and he reassured them, quote, nothing would fundamentally change if he won the election. He told these rich donors that Biden does not want to, quote, demonize the rich. And he said that if he wins the election, quote, no one's standard of living will change. Nothing would fundamentally change. And that's one of the few promises that Biden has kept. A poll from this January found that the wealthiest 10% of Americans own 93% of stocks. And the poll noted that this is the highest level ever recorded. And meanwhile, the bottom 50% of Americans hold just 1% of stocks. I need to repeat this because it's so incredible. The richest 10% of Americans have 93% of stocks, whereas the poorest half of Americans hold 1% of stocks. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis published similar data looking at U.S. wealth inequality this May. And keep in mind that these are conservative statistics. They noted that the top 10% of U.S. households hold 67% of total wealth. 2/3 of wealth held by the top 10% of households. Meanwhile, the poorest 50% of households, the poorest half of the country, hold 2.5% of total household wealth. And also, there is deep systemic racism in the US. Black families only have 23% of the wealth of white families, and Latino families only have 19% of the wealth of white families. So this is the reality of the so-called democracy in the US. And of course, we know that in reality, the US is not a democracy. This has been shown empirically by many academic studies. Back in 2014, there was a famous academic study done by scholars at Princeton University and Northwestern University. They looked at the data and they concluded that, quote, economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. The conclusion, in the words of the BBC, the U.S. is an oligarchy, not a democracy. Studies also show that more than 90% of the candidates running for the House of Representatives who have more funding win the election, and around 80% of the candidates running for Senate who have more funding win the election. What this shows is that the US is not a democracy, or it's the best so-called democracy that money can buy. It is a capitalist oligarchy controlled by a small handful of billionaire oligarchs. And they are funding Biden, they are funding Trump, they are funding other presidential candidates. Can you guess who were the largest donors to Barack Obama's campaign when he ran for president in 2008? The second biggest donor, Goldman Sachs, the investment bank. And one of the biggest donors, JP Morgan Chase, the biggest bank in the US, along with Citigroup, another huge bank, and of course, Google, Microsoft, other huge companies. And of course, Obama later bailed them out in the 2008 financial crisis. So they got more than their money's worth when they bought his election. And when Obama was running for his second term in the 2012 election, his competitor was the Republican Mitt Romney. And can you guess who were the largest donors to Mitt Romney's campaign? Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Credit Suisse, Citigroup, Barclays, Wells Fargo. You go down the list And of course, Blackstone, who today is one of the main funders of Donald Trump's campaign. Wall Street is what actually runs US politics, not the people. The people do not have any impact on government policy. Quite literally, academic studies show that. There is a negligible impact of average people on US government policy. The US government makes policy on behalf not only of the capitalist class in the US, but of capitalist oligarchs all around the world. Just the US alone, its stock market represents 61% of the size of the entire world's stock market. No country even remotely comes close. The US stock market is larger than all of the rest of the world's stock markets combined and then some. And who owns those stocks? Well, I already talked about how 1% of wealthy Americans own 93% of the stocks held by Americans. However, 40% of the total stocks in the US stock market actually belong to foreign capitalists because the US government, its goal is not only to preserve and inflate the wealth of the local capitalists, but of capitalist oligarchs all around the world. And of course, because the US dollar is the global reserve currency, capitalists all around the world hold their wealth in the form of US dollar assets. So when we look at these academic studies that show that the US government is not a democracy, it's an oligarchy, I must emphasize that it's an oligarchy representing billionaire oligarchs all around the world. That's why it's important to understand that the United States is the center of the global capitalist system, and Wall Street is the heart of world capitalism. And the figureheads in the White House and in Congress are simply the political representatives of Wall Street. I've talked a lot about how Blackstone is funding Trump and Republicans. Let's talk a little bit about BlackRock and its role in the Democratic Party. And this was reported by Bloomberg back in 2022. It noted in a headline titled, "Biden ties to BlackRock deepen with latest Treasury hire." It noted that Eric Van Nostrand, a BlackRock managing director, was exiting the firm to join Biden's Treasury Department as a senior advisor on economic issues tied to Russia and Ukraine. Oh, and by the way, can you guess what fund was later picked in order to oversee the privatization of the entire Ukrainian government and reconstruction? You can guess it, BlackRock. In 2023, Ukraine's Western-backed leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, on the official website of the president of Ukraine, he published an article boasting about how he met with the world's largest investment company on the creation of a fund for rebuilding Ukraine. Of course, he was talking about BlackRock. And essentially, Ukraine is implementing extreme neoliberal free market fundamentalist policies, essentially privatizing the entire government and allowing BlackRock to oversee all of this investment. Well, going back to this Bloomberg article, we can see that one of the top officials, one of the top economic advisors in the Biden administration was a BlackRock managing director who was brought on to oversee economic issues related to Russia and Ukraine. I mean, the corruption is absolutely astounding. It is not hidden in any way. In Washington, they don't even consider this corruption. This is exactly how US politics operates. And this Bloomberg article noted that BlackRock, quote, has been gaining clout in Washington as the Biden administration has stocked its ranks with ex-BlackRock executives. That means the company is now seen as one of Wall Street's key conduits to the power center in Washington. As the Wall Street Journal put it in a separate article, quote, BlackRock emerges as Wall Street player in Biden administration. The article noted that Wall Street bankers, and in particular those from Goldman Sachs, have long held senior positions in the White House. Under President-elect Joe Biden, such roles are going to executives of BlackRock. A former Goldman Sachs executive held the Treasury Secretary post in 3 of the last 4 administrations, including under Trump. Instead, under Biden, 2 executives who worked at the asset management giant BlackRock will be senior Wall Street representatives. BlackRock's head of sustainable investing, Brian Deese, is running the National Economic Council, helping to oversee economic policy for Biden. And Adewale Wale Adeyemu, a former chief of staff to BlackRock's chief executive, was named as the number 2 at Biden's Treasury Department. So while BlackRock is helping to run Biden's Treasury, Donald Trump's Treasury was basically run by Goldman Sachs. Donald Trump's Treasury Secretary was Steve Mnuchin, who was a longtime Goldman Sachs banker, and he has $400 million in wealth and lives like a king. So despite the fact that Trump claims to be a populist and anti-establishment, back in 2017, Politico published an article that said everything about who Donald Trump was actually serving. The article was titled "Wall Street Relieved" as Trump picks Goldman banker as Treasury deputy. It noted that President Donald Trump nominated one of the more high-powered bankers on Wall Street to serve as Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin's deputy. Jim Donovan, a Goldman Sachs partner chosen to serve as deputy secretary. And the article also noted that Donald Trump's administration was packed with former executives from Goldman Sachs, including the National Economic Council director and the top White House advisors, including Steve Bannon, who also claims to be a so-called populist, and he oversees a global far-right movement that is very creatively called The Movement. But despite the fact that, again, he falsely claims to be a populist, Steve Bannon was also working at this parasitic Wall Street investment bank, Goldman Sachs. So again, don't believe the hype. Donald Trump is just as much of a puppet for the capitalist class, billionaire capitalist oligarchs, as Biden is. And Donald Trump is himself a billionaire. Of course, he's going to govern on behalf of his billionaire capitalist oligarch friends. So when you see that ridiculous propaganda claiming that Donald Trump is taking on the elites, realize that that's just nonsense. It's just hot air. In reality, Trump is part of the elites. He himself is part of the capitalist class. And I want to briefly here look more at Blackstone, because there's been a lot of attention to BlackRock, rightfully, which is the world's largest asset manager. It has $10 trillion of assets under management. It's a massively influential firm. But we also need to know more about Blackstone, because it is also a deeply destructive, parasitic group that is making huge sums of money, making the rich richer and richer, while destroying huge parts of the real economy and making people's lives tangibly worse. A group called the Private Equity Stakeholder Project published a very useful report that is titled "Blackstone Comes to Collect: How America's Largest Landlord and Wall Street's Highest Paid CEO Are Jacking Up Rents and Ramping Up Evictions." It notes that just in 1 year, in 2021, in one county in California, in San Diego, Blackstone bought 5,600 affordable housing units and quickly made them unaffordable by raising rents in some units between 43 and 64% in just 2 years. And it noted that as San Diego becomes increasingly unaffordable, throwing more families into homelessness, Blackstone's aggressiveness as the third largest landlord in the area is hiking up rents for thousands of units, which only adds to the problem. Blackstone owns and manages over 300,000 units of rental housing in the US, making it the largest landlord in the country. In just 2 years, Blackstone added 200,000 housing units to its portfolio. And then in 2022, Blackstone initiated a wave of evictions. And just in the last 6 months of 2022, they estimate that Blackstone filed to evict thousands of tenants. Meanwhile, Blackstone spent millions of dollars fighting against rent control in California, trying to prevent the government from restricting how much these big corporate landlords could raise rents by. There is nothing productive about this. This is pure parasitism. Now, the narrative that we hear from capitalists is they say, we must defend the capitalist system because who is going to innovate? If the government taxes away the wealth of the rich, then who is going to invest in creating more jobs, in creating new technologies? Well, in reality, what we see is that if you really want to be rich, you don't invest in creating jobs and in innovation and new technologies. You try to become a feudal landlord. You buy up huge sums of real estate. You buy financial assets for their yield. These financial capitalist oligarchs, they're not actually contributing to the real economy. They're not creating jobs. They are sucking wealth away from working families. They are sucking wealth away from actual productive industries in manufacturing. And this is one of the main reasons in the neoliberal era, since the rise of free market fundamentalism in the late 1970s, that we've seen the massive de-industrialization of the US economy and other financialized Western economies. They have destroyed their manufacturing sector, and instead, everything has become geared toward the service sector, and in particular, the financial industry. And what we see is that wages in the US, compensation, has been stagnant ever since the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s. And at the same time, compensation for workers in the financial sector, bankers, asset managers, these parasites, they have become richer and richer. Their compensation has more than doubled since the early 1980s, whereas the compensation of non-financial workers has been stagnant. And one of the clearest examples of how the financial industry is parasitic is private equity. And there's a very good book about this published by a lawyer named Brendan Ballou, and his book is titled Plunder: Private Equity's Plan to Pillage America. And one of the largest private equity funds in the United States is run by Blackstone, who is again funding Donald Trump's campaign and many Republicans. A textbook example of this is what private equity firms did to Toys R Us. Toys R Us was a major toy chain all across the US. They had 30,000 employees and they were all laid off. They all lost their jobs because what happened? A private equity firm bought up Toys R Us, destroyed it, and sold it for parts, and of course profited from it. These firms, again, they do not produce anything. They are literal parasites. They buy up existing institutions. They suck all of the wealth out of them. They give that wealth to their rich capitalist oligarch clients, and then they leave behind the husk. They often sell it for parts, they destroy it, and they lay off all of their workers. And private equity firms are coming for your family members, quite literally. There have been so many reports showing the horrific consequences of when private equity takes over retirement homes. And it leads to overdoses, bed sores, broken bones, extreme abuse. Private equity firms buy up nursing homes, they cut staff, they cut wages, they cut benefits, they cut food and other benefits for the elderly people who are there. And in some cases, this has even led to death of some of the patients who do not have sufficient treatment or even food, and they die. Private equity firms are also taking over hospitals, and doctors say that, quote, private equity in medicine is dangerous to patients. ProPublica published an investigation looking into what happened after Blackstone, which is funding Donald Trump, took over the nation's largest physician staffing firm. And what happened? A doctors group owned by Blackstone repeatedly sued poor clients. Low-income patients faced more aggressive debt collection lawsuits. So quite literally, they were harassing poor people who cannot afford to pay their medical bills, which have been skyrocketing as well, in no small part due to private equity. Private equity is even coming for your pets. Private equity firms have been buying up veterinary offices, and what are the results? Higher prices and lower quality. And it shouldn't come as a surprise to you at this point, but back in the 2008 financial crisis, private equity firms like Blackstone played a role in the crisis, and they also made a killing off of the crisis. This is a 2008 report in the New York Post. Blackstone sees green from subprime loans. And it noted that Blackstone was prepping to make bets in the toxic subprime market. And what are subprime loans? They're loans that were given to people by banks, often illegally, criminally, and they were given to these people when they knew that the person taking the loan couldn't pay back the loan. It was often people who didn't make enough money, they didn't even have a job, but the banks engaged in these fraudulent practices to give people loans in order to inflate asset prices. And then Blackstone saw an opportunity when all of these poor people were defaulting on their subprime loans that the banks illegally gave them. So what happened? Blackstone partnered with a Florida firm called Bayview Financial. Their plan was to use Bayview's mortgage servicing arm to locate troubled loans on the cheap, including those whose payments have stopped. And then once Bayview locates a loan, it will renegotiate the terms such as to get laggard payments back on track. So in other words, Blackstone was working with debt sharks, trying to get poor people trapped in debt they couldn't pay off, trying to force them to pay in order for that money to make Blackstone's rich clients even richer. So making rich capitalist oligarchs richer at the expense of poor people who can't pay their rent because the bank should not have given them a loan, but it did in many cases illegally. And what did Blackstone do with those subprime mortgages? It turned around and resold them or securitized the loans for a profit. And then if a poor person could not pay the mortgage, what happened? Well, Blackstone also had the option of taking hold of properties when mortgages default. So making the poor person homeless and taking over their house. These firms, like Blackstone, are parasites, and they are the parasitic Wall Street firms that fund US politicians and basically control US politics. The US is not a democracy. I've shown that very clearly today. The US political system is a capitalist oligarchy controlled by a small handful of billionaire capitalist oligarchs and these Wall Street institutions that represent them, that make them richer and richer. And they are parasites who destroy the real economy, and they engage in speculation in order to make big financial bubbles to make themselves richer while everyone else gets poorer. And the Democratic Party and the Republican Party both represent that capitalist class. Do not fall for this nonsense propaganda that claims that Donald Trump is a populist who's going to drain the swamp and fight the establishment. He is funded by the same firms on Wall Street, and in every single presidential election in the US, it is Wall Street who wins. It doesn't matter who the candidate is. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I'm Ben Norton. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. If you like the work that we do, please like and subscribe, please share, and I will see you all next time. Thanks a lot.